Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my virtual talk. Usually I give this 1 hour presentation on a regular, like presential research ed, but due to the circumstances, we're gonna do a 30-minute online presentation. So I will be skipping a few slides just because we don't have time to go through all of them, but everything will be available for you afterwards. So feel free to just get back to my slides, read them at your own time. And also if you have anything to discuss or question or ask, just you can get in touch with me on Twitter. This is my Twitter handle, and also via email. All right, so the title of my presentation is Helping Students Use Effective Learning Strategies. I'm not gonna talk about myself today, just very quickly let you know that I am currently, for the past 2 years, 2.5 years, the chief scientist at Seneca Learning. So my job is to make sure that our methodology is fully based on neuroscience, and it is. And we just reached 3 million people using our website, and it's being, I think we're happy to support schools also during this complicated time where everybody's a bit clueless on what to do and how to navigate this situation. Um, I'll have the link to the page on the slides. So if you want to go back to the slides and click on it, you can get to know our work a little bit more. All right, so this presentation is usually in 4 parts. I talk about effective learning strategies. I talk about why don't students use them. I talk about how we can help them do so, and then I explain Seneca. Because of the time that is a bit limited today, I will be focusing on the 2 middle ones here. All right, so effective learning strategies. These are the strategies that, according to research, work better than others. So if you take people to the lab, if you do school interventions and you compare different learning strategies, you see that some of them work better than other ones. And these are what we call the effective learning strategies. They are the ones based on actual science and actual evidence. There are several of them. A few of the most important ones are retrieval practice, which is the idea that you can bring information back to mind and that is more helpful for your learning than if you just try to read passively through a book or watch a video. So every time that you are active in remembering information, that information becomes stronger in your head. You do have to be careful with misconceptions because everything that you recover, that you retrieve, will get stronger. So if you are retrieving the wrong information, that information becomes stronger in your head as well. The way I like to think about retrieval practice is like a maze. So imagine that the exit, the answer of a question is the exit of the maze and the entrance is the question. So if you're always reading the same text over and over again, there is only one path in your brain that leads you from the entrance to the exit of the maze. But by doing retrieval practice, you end up creating several new connections between pieces of information. So you get to create several different paths that lead you from the entrance to the exit, which makes it easier for you to get to the exit. So that's one reason why I like to think retrieval practice works very well. The second and the third one are spacing and interleaving. So that's the idea that you can spread out your study sessions. I'm saying your study, but obviously students. You can spread out study sessions and switch between topics every now and then. So that's not new. We've known these things, it's hidden here, but like 17 something, like 200 years already. And the idea is that you learn something once, you're gonna forget that. And that's just normal, that's just how the brain works. If you learn that again, you're gonna forget that a bit slower. If you learn it again, you're gonna forget it a bit less and a bit less and a bit less. So the idea here is that you can cram and spend 20 hours straight away studying biology. You're just gonna forget that. But if you do like 2 hours and then a break and then 2 hours and then a break and then 2 hours and then a break, that will be better for your learning than doing everything at once. So that's from students working at home. It's important to always revisit the same topic so that you can get better and better at these curves here. But also in the classroom, when we get back to the classroom, it's important to always revisit old topics as well. So we shouldn't be doing like Unit 1 and moving on to Unit 2 and never going back to Unit 1. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you a few suggestions on how we can do that as teachers in the classroom. But there's also the topic of the curriculum as a bigger thing. So I gave this presentation once and somebody said, well, there's only so much we can do as teachers in the classroom if we have to cover like this big curriculum. We don't really have time to go back to the previous topics. So I will give you some suggestions on how you can do a little bit of that. But I do agree that we do need a bigger conversation about the curriculum, how it is structured, and how we can really allow teachers and students to use effective learning strategies without having to rush through the curriculum so they can cover everything for exams. And lastly, another strategy is dual coding. So that's the idea of combining words with visual elements to reduce your cognitive load. I do have other slides on cognitive load theory. If you want, I can send them later. But the idea here is that if you combine words and images and they really go together, that's easier for your brain to process the information and easier for the brain to remember that information later on. So that's how it helps. There are a lot of different papers and articles about those strategies. So this is a very good and famous one, and this is another very good and very famous one. There is a whole bunch of different blogs and websites and conferences that you can go to learn more about retrieval techniques. And there is, if you're a science teacher, there is a whole email list on that's called Cog Sci-Sci. So you can see there, they're very active and they're very, very clever, and they're always sharing different strategies. Right. So I rushed through a bit of this first part because you can find all the information really in all of those articles, and it's very easy to find. What I want to talk to you about is, okay, we have all of the information, but do students use it? Do students know how to study effectively? And the answer is no. So when we started at Seneca, we ran a survey asking students to tick which strategy they used to use, and only 24% of them said they were using effective learning strategies. Let me just check the time. That's okay. Only 24% of them said that they were using effective learning strategies, which means that 3/4 of them were not. And that's just our tiny research, but there's a lot of other ones. So for example, in 2009, it was shown that only 11% of students use retrieval practice. In 2007, it was shown that only 16% of them use testing to enhance learning. And more recently, in 2017, these authors said that even if you take only students that know what the effective learning strategies are, 34% of them still don't use them. So what they did was to send a list of strategies to students and say which ones are the ones that work better. And then they took only the students that selected the right ones and say, okay, which ones do you use? And like 34% of them were still not using. So even though they knew which ones they should be using, they still did not use the effective learning strategies. All right, there's a few more data, and that's what I wanted to show you. So it's covering the name of the author here, but it's one of those three that I mentioned before. So for example, how do you decide what to study next? Some of the options were whatever's due soonest, or I plan my study schedule ahead of time and study whatever I've scheduled. So basically this means cramming, and this means spacing and interleaving. And you can see here that 59% of them said they just cram, and only 11% of them said that they do spacing and interleaving. Another one was, do you usually return to the course material to review it after a course has finished? And only 14% of them did that. So that means that students will cram for an exam, and the moment that the exam passes, that's it. They just never go back to the material again. And the final one here was, imagine that in the course of studying, you become convinced that you know the answer to a certain question very well. What would you do? So the options were, make sure to study yourself, to study or test yourself again, or put it aside and focus on something else. So again, the idea that if you learn something, that's it, you're done, or against the idea that you always have to revisit past topics and keep testing yourself to make the information stronger in your head. And as you can see here, only 36% of them do that. 64% of them says, I know this, done, which they don't realize that they're forgetting code. So they may know it now, but if they don't revise it again, they will forget. So it will be for nothing. This is another table. So again, what strategies do you use? And then you can say here, the yellow ones are the ones that are kind of mixed. So they could be good, but they could be bad as well. So this table is not very informative. For example, do practice problems. It can be very good if you do any retrieval practice. So if you're reading a question and really trying to answer it. But if you're just going through the answer, like reading and then reading the answer, that's just like reading notes, so that doesn't work. Same with flashcards. If you read the question and you really try to answer that before flipping the card, that's good. If you just flip immediately, it's like reading notes, that's no good. And lastly, study with a group of students. If you are asking each other questions, if you are challenging and testing each other, that's very good. If you are just, sitting next to each other reading a textbook, it's no good. If you are just talking about Netflix, then that's also not good. So the most important ones on that table are the ones that are very specific. So rereading notes or textbook and practice recall. You can see here that 84% of students reread their notes, only 10 or 11% of them do retrieval practice. And when you ask them if that's your number one strategy, then more than half of them are. And only 1% of them use retrieval practice as the main strategy. So the strategy that we know work the best is only used for 1% of students really as their number one strategy. And reading notes and rereading the same piece of information over and over again, which we know does not work very well, at least for long-term learning, is used by almost everybody. So this is from a couple of years ago. You remember when they took the picture of the black hole? So the way I see it is that we have all of that information about what are the good learning strategies, but they are kind of stuck in the black hole here, and then students are around it, and that information does not reach them. So, researchers are researching, teachers are learning about that, but students are still just reading their notes over and over again and highlighting them, which is just not the good way to study. So the third part of the second part of the talk is why don't students use them? So we know what they are, and we know that students don't use them based on the research that I showed you. Why don't they use them? There are three main reasons. One of them is that students are not aware that retrieval practice enhances learning. That's a conclusion from Karpik et al., which is one of those articles that I showed you before. So what they mean here is that they just don't know. So if I ask my parents, how do you study for an exam? They'll be like, read your notes. If I ask my teachers that were my high school teachers 15 years ago, how do you study for your exams? They'll be like, read your notes. So they just don't know how to study, right? And there's a quote here that again is a bit covered by my head, but you can read that later. The idea that if you hire somebody to paint the walls of your flat, and that person has been painting walls for 13 years, you expect them to be very good at painting walls. So I expect them to know all the techniques and to be very efficient and effective in how they do so. But that's not true for students. So students, in this case, they reach college or university, in this case here, after 13 years of being students, and they still don't know how to study. So if somebody's been doing something for 13 years, they should be quite good at it. But students have been studying for 13 years and they still do not know how to study in a good way. The second reason why so that was the first reason, students just don't know how to study. The second reason is something called illusion of competence. I don't know if this works, virtually, but it's a visual illusion where it seems like the circles are moving, but they're actually not. This is just a JPEG image, but it's a visual illusion. It has nothing to do with my talk, but it's just my favorite visual illusion. Okay, so what is illusion of competence? It's the idea, it's when you overestimate your future performance based on your current performance. So when you are studying, you have the questions and you have the answer. When you are being tested on an actual exam, you only have the answer, you do not have the you only have the question, you do not have the answer. So what happens is that when you are studying, you overestimate how well you're gonna do when you are being tested. And that harms the way you choose to study. So let me show you some data to explain that better. So participants in this study, participants had to learn pairs of words, and they could either study there by reading the pairs over and over again, so the same two words, a list of two words, or they could study them by being tested. So they saw the first word and had to remember the second one. And then there was the actual test. But when they were studying, they also had to judge how well they would do on a future test. And you can see here on this first graph that the black lines, black columns, are the words that were studied with testing, and the gray ones are words that were studying with just reading, pretty much. And this is how they got on the exam. You can see that they did much better with the words that they studied via testing, which is great, which is what we knew. So retrieval practice works better than just reading. We know that. But then the interesting bit about this article is what students thought would happen. So they thought that they would do better with the words they were studying via reading. And that's purely because of illusion of competence. So because they had the answer right there, then they were overestimating how well they would do in the future. So one reason that students choose or keep choosing to study with just reading and highlighting is that it feels like that works better than being tested. But it doesn't, but it feels like it does. So that's why you choose them. And the third strategy from my reading that students, the reason why they don't do effective learning strategies is because it's just time consuming and harder to do. So, just being realistic, planning study sessions weeks ahead and sticking to the chronogram is harder than just cramming the night before. Creating mind maps is harder than writing summaries, and answering questions being tested is harder than just lying in bed and reading a textbook. So 3 reasons. 1, students don't know. There are different ways to study other than just reading and highlighting. 2, it feels like reading and highlighting works better than being tested. And 3, being tested and doing dual coding and spacing and interleaving is just very time consuming and more difficult. So why do it? Okay, so the third part of my talk is, can we help students to improve? So we know what the learning strategies are. We know that students do not use them. Is there anything that we can do to help them? And yes, there is. So if one of the reasons that students don't use effective learning strategies is because they don't know those strategies, then we have to teach them. So the same way that we explicitly teach them about biology and geography, we have to explicitly teach them about learning. How do you learn? How does your brain work? What is memory? And why does being tested work better than reading? And there are several different sources for you on the internet. So I obviously I think everybody does, like the Learning Scientists very much. And they have a lot of articles and cool things for teachers, but they also have things directly as students. So they have a YouTube channel that's only about explaining why some strategies work better than others. In schools, you can have assemblies, you can have parents' evenings, because parents most of the times will not know what good strategies are. So you have to teach parents as well. And just teach them about the brain and memory. There are videos, there are blogs. So this is one blog that I wrote with Nimish Lad on how to create a revision timetable. There are a lot of resources on the internet that you can use to actually, students need to be told how to study, basically. I'm not gonna play this now, but you can look for it on YouTube. I think it's a really, really, really good video. He has other videos as well, but this is the main one. So what he does here, he is a Cambridge student, I think he's probably graduated by now, but medicine. And he has this video explaining how he studies for his exams. And everything that I just said, he does, which is great. And he has like some very high-tech videos as well. So you can see he has like this graph showing up. And then he gives the example of what he does when he is in school, in university. And then he also shows the research behind that technique and why that works. And because he is a student, I think it is also maybe more convincing for students to hear him talking than to hear us talking. You know how students are. If it comes from a peer, it's probably more convincing than when it comes from an adult. The second thing that we can do to help students use effective learning strategies is to kind of lead by example and use strategies ourselves in the classroom. I have a few suggestions. So I told you that before. I was going to give you a few suggestions on how to use retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, and dual coding in the classroom to revisit previous parts of the content. So the first one is called hanging connections. And it was suggested to me at another talk that I went to. It's mainly for primary students, but you can do it for secondary students, I guess, as well. So the idea here is that this is like a 3D mind map where students have to stick different pieces of information to the arms of the hanger and then stick other ones until they create this very nice mind map. So it's a visual representation of how information connects to each other, which is great. And then the other three are color-coded retrieval practice, retrieval grid, and retrieval roulette. So color-coded retrieval practice is by Blake Harvard, and I think it's a very good one because it kind of ticks all the boxes. It does retrieval practice, it does spacing, and it does dual coding, and even does a bit of metacognition as well. So the idea here is that you ask students a question, and they have to answer that question without checking any notes, and they highlight what they write, let's say in pink. And then they check the notes, and they complete the answer and highlight that in yellow. And then the next week or a couple of weeks later, you do the same thing again, the same question, same answers, and students have to compare how much pink and how much yellow they have. So the idea is that because they are using retrieval practice, they are being asked to remember the information, and because you are spacing that out, so spreading that, the amount of pink should be increasing and the amount of yellow should be decreasing. So that means that's also good for metacognition because students can visualize their learning. So I think that's a very good one. It's also less work because it's the same question that you're just asking twice. And it's very easy for students to realize that, okay, this is working, this is a good technique, and I am learning more and I am being able to remember and explain things better even without checking my notes. The second one is the challenge grid, which is by Kate Jones. And also a bit of dual coding because you have color-coded questions. But the idea here is that she runs a competition with her students, and if they answer a blue question right, they get 1 point. If they get a red question right, they get 2 points. A purple question, they get 4 points. And the reason for that is that blue questions are about topics that were covered last lesson. Red questions are about topics that were covered last week, and green questions 2 weeks ago, and so on. So the further students are able to remember the information, the more points they get. So this is doing retrieval practice because they have to remember the information. They are bringing the information back in their head. It does spacing and interleaving because you're going back to revisit previous information, previous topics, and interleaving also because you are testing different bits of the content. So you're not, such as a history teacher, you're not only asking about the Roman Empire. You're asking about all different topics that you've covered so far. And Retrieval Roulette, which I guess most of you know. So this is Adam Boxer. There is, if you go to his website, there is a template to download, and you can actually download all the thousands of questions that they already have there. So basically, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and you have questions, you have the answers, and you have the name of the topic. And then there is a formula in one of those tabs where you say, I want 5 questions from last week, from something that we taught last week, and I want 20 questions from wherever past in the curriculum we've been. and then it randomly generates those questions for you. So it's retrieval practice because students have to remember that. It is spacing and interleaving because you are revisiting past topics and you are mixing, interleaving different topics, not only covering Unit 1 only. You're doing a bit of Unit 1, a bit of Unit 3, a bit of Unit 5. And the last reason, if you remember, why students don't use effective learning strategies is because they are time consuming and hard to do. So one way to help them is to give them tools that make that easier. There are a lot of them. Obviously, Seneca is the best one, but there are also other available tools out there. Right, so as a summary, before I stop, we know that some strategies work better than others. This has been shown like by actual research, actual evidence, controlled experiments, randomized controlled trials, like proper research, and has been replicated several times in several grades or key stages. And we know all of that. There's a lot of resources out there, both for students and for teachers, explaining what the good strategies are. But most students do not use those strategies, as I showed on those tables and research pieces. And there are 3 reasons why they don't do them. 1 is because they don't know what to do. 2 is because it feels like those strategies don't work, which is the illusion of competence. And 3 is that they're just too hard. So we can help them by having an evidence-based classroom where we can show them how to use good strategies and we can show them that they work. And we can explicitly teach them how to study. We can have online tools that help them do so. And we should also have a conversation about the curriculum to really make that easier for everybody to revisit past topics instead of just rushing through the content. That's it. No leaflets on a virtual meeting, but just please do contact me on Twitter and email, and I will make those slides available for you. And if you are interested in learning more about Seneca, it's all of that there with the website links and everything else. Thank you. Bye bye.